Hello, my name is Stephen Lee, and welcome to the first webcast of Market Observations. Today's webcast will be focused on capital management and how capital can best be managed in the current economic environment. After 5+ years of quantitative easing by global central banks, our current economic environment can best be described as artificially inflated. And this webcast titled Liquidity Trap will highlight why financial capital is at risk, what to do with financial capital now, and how best to manage financial capital in the years ahead. What exactly is a liquidity trap? A liquidity trap is a situation described in Keynesian economics in which injections of cash into the private banking system by a central bank fail to lower the interest rates and hence fail to stimulate economic growth. A liquidity trap is caused when people hoard cash because they expect an adverse event such as deflation, insufficient aggregate demand, or war. Signature characteristics of a liquidity trap are short-term interest rates that are near zero and fluctuations in the monetary base that fail to translate into fluctuations in general price levels. Let's ponder this definition of a liquidity trap for a moment because it is important to understand what is occurring in our financial system today. Since the financial crisis in 2008, the central bank, which is the Federal Reserve, has been battling deflation with several monetary policy tools, including QE and ZIRP. QE is quantitative easing, and ZIRP is zero interest rate policy. Both QE and ZIRP are unconventional monetary policies used by central banks to stimulate the economy when standard monetary policy has become ineffective. This combination of QE and ZIRP by the Fed has succeeded in inflating asset prices for the affluent, but the broader economy continues to show signs of malaise in wage inflation and full employment, which is in turn now negatively affecting aggregate demand. With interest rates for Treasury bills at or near 0%, and QE having not succeeded in creating enough wage inflation, our Federal Reserve System is by definition stuck in a liquidity trap in which injections of cash into the private banking system is failing to stimulate economic growth, even in nominal terms. Given these serious economic circumstances, this webcast, Liquidity Trap, is intended for financial professionals and institutions, as this webcast will show why financial capital is at risk, what to do with capital now, and how best to manage financial capital in the years ahead. Financial capital is any economic resource measured in terms of money, which includes stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and real estate investment trusts. First, let's go over part 1, why financial capital is at risk. After 5.5 years of highly accommodative monetary policy by the Federal Reserve, which included over $4 trillion in quantitative easing, while maintaining a near zero interest rate policy, U.S. stock and bond prices have increased and are near its all-time highs, mostly driven by quantitative easing, which on a monthly basis purchased specified amounts of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities in the open market. These open market operations of MBS and Treasury purchases directly affected the prices of those securities positively, and generally reinforced the aphorism, "A rising tide lifts all boats," in a most profound sense. Not only did Treasury and MBS prices rise, the whole U.S. bond sector, including corporates, municipals, and treasuries, all rose from the immense Fed effort to influence financial capital. In addition to rising bond prices, QE also had the general effect of indirectly pushing the prices of stocks up through a combination of lower borrowing costs for stock buybacks, which made it cheaper for businesses to reform the capital structure from stocks to bonds, and the substitution effect, which lowered yields in the bond market, resulting from QE and has investors seeking yield and returns in the equity markets now. Simply put, Federal Reserve monetary policy since 2008 inflated asset prices so that now both stocks and bonds are overvalued on a long-term historical basis. How much so? Let's take a look at the next slide to find out. I call this the triple O chart because it identifies overvalued, overbought, and overbullish S&P 500 extremes since 1928. To qualify for a triple O extreme, the following 7 fundamental, technical, and psychology extremes threshold must all occur at the same time and is listed in order on the top left-hand side of the chart. First, the cyclically adjusted PE ratio must be greater than 18. This is also known as the Shiller-Cape ratio and can be found on Robert Shiller's website. Second, the S&P 500 must be within 3% of weekly upper Bollinger Band. Third, the S&P 500 must be more than 60% above 5-year low. Fourth, the S&P 500 must be more than 7% above its 12-month smoothing. Fifth, the S&P 500 must be more than 12% above its 20-month smoothing. Sixth, the 2-week bullish sentiment must be greater than 53%, while the 2-week bearish sentiment must also be below 28%. Finally, the 10-year bond yield spread over 3-month T-bills must be less than 3%. Since 1928, the occurrence of all 7 extremes at the same time is plotted as a vertical line in this chart. You will notice that these vertical lines do not happen often, but when they do, it usually signals a market top. Some successful predictions of market tops include the 1928, 1973, 1987, 2000, and 2007 corrections. What is interesting here is if you look at the right side of the chart, these vertical lines have become even more pronounced this year, in 2014. Caution is warranted here in the financial markets, as this chart is telling us that the stock market is overvalued, overbought, and in overly bullish territory. A market correction is highly probable and perhaps imminent. I discovered this chart on John Hussman's website, which is located at hussmanfunds.com. He does excellent work in analytical studies of capital markets, and it may be worth your while to visit his website for his take on the markets. His weekly market comment section is a wealth of information, and his firm also runs several funds which may be appropriate for your particular investment objectives. In summary, this triple-O chart has been a good predictor of overvalued, overbought, and overbullish extremes, since all 7 extremes must occur at the same time to satisfy the fundamental, technical, and psychological triggers. Right now, this chart has been flashing multiple warning signals all year long. If you will recall, the theme of today's market observations is the Federal Reserve's dilemma of being caught in a liquidity trap, in which its unconventional monetary policies of QE and ZIRP have inflated asset prices but have now been ineffective in increasing further aggregate demand. That is why, since last November, the Fed has begun to taper QE and looks to exit QE completely before year-end. In other words, the punch bowl that has been keeping this equity party going for several years will run dry soon. QE has been inflating this market. Once it stops, this market will correct, and most likely to a large extent. Please give careful attention to this chart's warning and manage capital in accordance with your risk tolerance and investment objectives. If you are not convinced that we are at or near a market top, perhaps this chart will refresh your memory of how you felt at previous market tops just before a major correction. This chart of the S&P 500 includes 2 overlays: net equity inflows and the psychological investing cycle. The black line is the S&P 500 fluctuation from years 2002 to 2014. The red bar overlay is negative equity fund flows, while the green bar overlay is the positive equity fund flows. The boxes contain one-word descriptions of the psychological investing cycle from market bottoms to market tops. There are valuable lessons we can learn from previous investing cycles. As illustrated on this chart, over the past 7 years, we went from euphoria at the last market top in 2007 to anxiety, followed by denial, fear, desperation, panic, capitulation, and despondency at the market bottom in 2009. From there, the psychological cycle continues into depression, hope, relief, optimism, excitement, thrill, and now full circle to euphoria again. The saying, hindsight is 20/20, but foresight is priceless, could offer us some wisdom here. In hindsight, buying on despondency seemed timely, however illogical it may have seemed back then. With market participants in euphoria mode now, what foresight may be observed from this chart? If you look closely on the right side of the chart, the green bars indicating positive equity inflows are on a decline. On a fundamental basis, this is why financial capital is at risk. Equity outflows may soon replace equity inflows. Everyone that wants to be in the market is back in. This is typical of euphoric market tops. When all buyers are back in, future buying power is diminished. When buying power is exhausted and sellers overpower buyers, declines in market prices are inevitable. Thank you to Lance Roberts at StreetTalkLive.com for your permission to use this wonderful chart, and the following one too. For those seeking another opinion on the markets, their website and talk show is a great way to gather additional information for managing your financial capital. This chart, titled Extreme Complacency Seen Near End of Cycles, contains an overlay of the S&P 500 index over the volatility index. The red line is the S&P 500 price movement from 2002 to 2014. The blue line is a volatility index over the same time period. The left axis measures S&P 500 price levels, while the right axis measures volatility. The S&P 500 and the volatility index typically move inversely from each other. As depicted near the middle of this chart, pronounced higher volatility was last seen during the financial crisis of 2008, in which the volatility index spiked into the high 70s, while the S&P 500 price levels moved inversely and declined. This volatile episode was followed by two moderate spikes in volatility in 2010 and 2011 from Eurozone concerns. In these episodes, S&P 500 price level and the volatility index also moved inversely with each other. Volatility spikes up when markets drop. The usefulness of the volatility index is twofold. Generally used by traders and investors to get a sense of how much fear or complacency is in the markets, this chart is better used as a buy indicator when volatility is high, but can also be used as a sell indicator too when extreme levels of complacency are reached as it is now. In fact, we have now reached the same low levels of volatility last seen in 2007, right before a major correction occurred. In addition, the length of this market complacency since the last volatility spike in 2011 is noteworthy. Long periods of market complacency, such as the one we are currently in, can lull investors into a false sense of security. Stay invested at your own discretion. This next chart was constructed by Doug Short, who does excellent financial data management, and certainly worth following for his commentaries on his website, dshort.com, which was acquired by Advisor Perspectives back in 2011. Doug's chart, titled NYSE Investor Credit and the Market, is widely followed in many financial circles because of its effectiveness on exposing market bubbles, or more specifically, margin-induced bubbles, by using data available through the New York Stock Exchange. This chart reveals three observable facts. First, the blue line tracks the price levels of the S&P 500 from 1980 to 2014. You will notice that the index peaked in years 2000 and 2007. Second, the area shaded turquoise green is positive NYSE credit balances, which results from investors and institutions liquidating various financial assets, such as stocks and bonds. These liquidations or sales settle in cash money, thereby increasing credit balances, sometimes resulting in positive NYSE credit balances in the area shaded turquoise green. Third, the area shaded red is negative NYSE debit balances from investors and institutions going on margin or borrowing on leverage to buy more assets, which can include physical assets such as commodities, or financial assets, which can include stocks and bond holdings. Incorporating the three observable facts that we just examined, we can reasonably form some inferences about positive and negative NYSE credit balances in relation to the S&P 500 market index. Market bottoms are characterized by positive credit balances, such as the areas shaded turquoise green, while market tops feature high levels of negative credit balances in the area shaded red. With these inferences on credit balances, we can conclude that when the shaded red area spikes downward, as it did in the 2000 tech bubble, in the 2007 housing bubble, excessive risk-taking on borrowed money is taking place. This ultimately results in the correction of the excesses that were built on margin, when speculators and investors run out of resources to sustain an overly leveraged market. Recently, levels of negative credit balancing exceed that of the last two market tops, with dire implications. Now would be a good time to reconsider your overall asset allocation. Based on the heavy margin borrowing that is propping up this market, disciplined investing involves reducing risk when high levels of speculative borrowing are evident, as it is now. This next chart is provided courtesy of SentimentTrader.com. I've been following this site for about 7 years now and remain impressed by how much pertinent financial data is available here. Jason, who manages this site, does a great job of dissecting raw data as it pertains to investor sentiment in various asset classes. The title of this chart is Investor Bets in Risky Assets versus Safe Assets, in which risky assets are equity funds and safe assets are money market funds. This chart covers a time period from 1984 to 2014. The concept of this chart is to illustrate the ratio of equity fund assets to money market fund assets with the S&P 500 index overlaid on top. The purpose behind illustrating the ratio of risky assets to safe assets is to measure the degree of investor preference for safety over risk or risk over safety. The risk versus safety preference can be inferred from the ratio of equity fund assets to money market fund assets on this chart. As illustrated in prior market peaks in 2000 and 2007, for every dollar in cash, investors had about $3 invested in stocks. At these market peaks, investors preferred risk-taking over safety, while conversely preferring safety over risk at the market bottoms in 2002 and 2009, when the ratio of risky to safe assets was about equal at 1-to-1. Recently, this chart now shows that we are setting new records of risky bets versus safe bets, as investors now have $4 invested in stocks for every $1 in cash. This indicates that investors are now at risk-taking extremes similar to previous market tops. This is bearish for the stock markets. Over the past 7 slides, we've been discussing why financial capital is at risk. We reviewed what a liquidity trap was and the dilemma that is facing the Federal Reserve. Then we studied the triple O chart that is warning about a market in an overvalued, overbought, and overbullish extremes. In addition, net equity inflows have steadily been declining, while extended market complacency has lulled investors into a false sense of security. Finally, we went over 2 more charts showing the massive NYSE negative investor credit balances and a new record of investors piling into risky assets versus safe assets. Linking all the data we reviewed so far in these charts, the message is clear. The stock market is now displaying fundamental, technical, and psychological warnings similar in other market tops, so be prepared for a market correction. A good way to prepare for a market correction is to be mentally ready. One way to mentally prepare is to imagine yourself in the eye of the storm. As some of you may know, the eye of the storm is the calm region at the center of a storm. In order to completely get out of the storm, one must exit the relative calmness and safety of the eye and proceed as quickly as possible to the edge of the storm. Since the financial storm hit the economy in 2008, Federal Reserve policy actions such as maintaining a near zero interest rate policy, in addition to massive quantitative easing of over $4 trillion, have provided a shield for the economy against deflation. However, this deflation shield is wearing out. QE is expected to end later this year for 2 important reasons. 1. QE is draining too much quality collateral from our banking system. 2. The Fed is in a liquidity trap in which additional QE is ineffective. While QE did push asset prices up over the past 5 years, unfortunately, our economy to this day have not yet reached escape velocity against deflationary forces. Little to no inflation in wages confirms this. In addition to lack of wage inflation, the quantity and quality of jobs created since the start of the financial crisis is of a concern. We simply aren't creating enough jobs to keep up with our demographics. As this chart from JP Morgan Asset Management illustrates, U.S. total private payroll on the right side of the chart lost 8.8 million jobs in the last recession and have now recovered 8.7 million jobs. But this is after the federal government accumulated an additional $7 trillion in debt since the beginning of 2008 to stimulate the economy. As of today, the federal government is over $17 trillion in debt. Including states and municipalities, that number goes up to over $20 trillion. Pile on entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, U.S. total unfunded liabilities is at least $70 trillion, and this is a conservative number too. We simply do not have the luxury to continue to take on debt at this pace any longer. $7 trillion of debt to create only 8.7 million jobs should be alarming for Congress. This is the equivalent of spending $804,000 for every job created. Our current fiscal policy, as it relates to job creation, simply does not add up sensibly. What's more, the left side of the chart measuring the official civilian unemployment rate is underreporting the unemployment in contrast to actual unemployment that is occurring in the economy. This BLS, or Bureau of Labor Statistics U3 unemployment data, used here can be somewhat misleading, as it does not include discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, and part-time workers who want to work full-time. Using the broader BLS U6 unemployment data that does include discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, and part-time workers who want to work full-time will show that the broader measure of unemployment is actually 12% versus the official 6% that is reported. Nevertheless, an optimist can argue that the left and right sides of this chart taken together shows improving unemployment rates as well as job creation. However, let's be more realistic about our current employment environment. It has gotten better for some, but the total aggregate workforce has a shortage of wage inflation in addition to job creation that is not keeping up with the growth in population. These shortfalls in the current employment environment are another reason why financial capital is at risk. Capital accumulation, which is at the heart of capitalism, depends on a robust labor force to perpetuate the creation of additional capital. Right now, capital is suppressing labor growth in the form of record profits that is not trickling back down to labor. The irony of this contradiction in the relationship between capital and labor is the reason why financial capital is at risk. Capital accumulation includes investment in financial assets such as the equity market. Capital in this market has two values, nominal value and real value. Nominal value is the economic value expressed in monetary terms, such as the dollar. Real value is a measure of purchasing power net of any price changes over time, and is a more reliable gauge of genuine capital accumulation than nominal value. This slide has two S&P 500 charts. Let's focus on the top one first. This top chart illustrates the S&P 500 since 1994 in nominal dollar terms. Notice the last two market peaks in the years 2000 and 2007, when the S&P 500 topped out slightly above the 1500 level. Today, the market appears higher than the last two peaks in nominal terms. But what if we measure the price levels of the index with gold prices instead of dollars? The bottom chart divides the value of the S&P 500 by the price of spot gold per ounce. The divergence between the chart on the bottom and the chart on top is not uncommon between nominal and real values. The S&P chart on the bottom measures how this index of U.S. stocks is performing in terms of gold prices rather than in nominal dollars. Since gold as a physical commodity does not itself fluctuate, but in dollar terms, it retains real value despite nominal value changes. That is why dividing this index by spot gold has the effect of converting the S&P 500 nominal values into S&P 500 values based on gold prices per ounce. As the bottom chart reveals, the S&P 500 is not at an all-time high when we measure the price levels of the index with gold. The bottom chart contradicts the nominal gains of the S&P on the top chart. In this example, nominal price movements in the top chart can be quite misleading as a barometer of real value. Highly accommodative monetary policies such as QE and ZIRP have inflated asset prices such as the S&P 500 to artificially lofty levels. This makes the current market more risky because it is vulnerable to market shocks that can deflate capital in nominal terms to a larger extent than one in which genuine markets prevailed. So far, we've gone over why financial capital is at risk by reviewing U.S. economic data, but how is Europe doing? Let's see. This slide has 3 charts, and we will focus on the top left-hand chart first, with the title of Unemployment Rate Quarterly. This chart compares the unemployment rate of the U.S. and the Eurozone from 1970 to March 2014. The purple line is the Eurozone unemployment rate, which is currently at 12.2%, while the gray line shows the U.S. unemployment rate at 7.1%. Since this chart uses the Bureau of Labor Statistics U3 data, the U.S. unemployment is underreported because U3 does not include discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, and part-time workers who want to work full-time. Using the broader BLS U6 data, U.S. unemployment is actually equivalent to Eurozone unemployment at about 12%. If we continue to see Eurozone unemployment trend increase, as it is currently doing now, this could have negative economic consequences for the United States as well as the rest of the world. Next, the chart on the right shows the unemployment rate for European countries ranked from the lowest unemployment on top and the most on the bottom. Spain's unemployment rate at 25% is particularly unsettling considering how much population that country has as compared to the entirety of the EU. Most of the countries in the EU remain in a recession and could slip into a deeper recession simply because unemployment is worsening. In addition, the chart on the bottom left, titled Europe Inflation, reveals declining inflation in the euro area, with the periphery of Europe actually seeing deflationary trends similar to the beginning of the recession in 2008. Generally, inflation at 2% is viewed by economists as the optimal inflation target for growth. This chart shows that the euro area is below the 2% optimal inflation zone for over 2 years now, and the trend of declining inflation may well turn into outright deflation. More needs to be done in this monetary union in terms of political and structural unity to avoid deflation. This is because a European Union under pressure from deflation will heighten financial capital risk globally. Our analysis of why financial capital is at risk must include a review of federal finances. This is because through the years, U.S. GDP growth has become more and more reliant on government spending. This chart by J.P. Morgan Asset Management will help illustrate the state of federal finances as approved by Congress. This chart actually has 3 subcharts, but we will only focus on the 2 bar charts on the left, which represent the 2014 federal budget. The furthermost bar chart to the left is the U.S. federal spending, while the bar chart to the right of it is the federal income. First, let's go over federal spending, which is the left bar. Starting at the bottom of the bar, we have Medicare and Medicaid expenses, which amount to $901 billion, or 25% of total spending. Next, we have Social Security, which amounts to $846 billion, or 24% of total spending. Defense spending amount to $604 billion, or 17% of total spending. Non-defense spending amount to $590 billion, or 17% of total spending. Net interest expenses amounted to $233 billion, or 7% of total spending, with other spending amount to about $369 billion, or 10% of the total. These are all CBO baseline forecasts. Federal income is the right bar. Starting at the bottom of the bar, we have the income tax receipts of $1.338 trillion, or 39% of total income. Next, we have corporate tax receipts of $351 billion, or 10% of total income. Social insurance income receipts total about $1 trillion, or 29% of total. Other income receipts of $263 billion brings approximate total income for 2014 to approximately $3 trillion. Please note that the federal expenses are currently higher than the U.S. federal income to the tune of about $500 billion per year. This deficit is financed through the borrowing at the Treasury Department. With over $17 trillion in federal debt already outstanding and growing, the United States federal budget is unsustainable long term. This chart is published by the Congressional Budget Office. The official title of this chart is Federal Debt Held by the Public under CBO's Extended Baseline, which illustrates actual and projected federal debt held by the public in terms of percentage of GDP. A debt-to-GDP ratio below 60% is ordinarily the prudent rule for developed countries, while a debt-to-GDP ratio below 40% is the suggested guide for developing economies. Currently, the U.S. ratio is above 70, which indicates a highly indebted economy relative to GDP. Additionally, this data does not include the IOUs from the Social Security Trust Fund or Medicare. If the present value of the next 75 years of these intragovernmental debt are included, the federal debt would be $70 trillion. Divide $70 trillion with this year's forecasted GDP of $16.9 trillion, the federal debt to GDP ratio would be 414%, an enormous difference and potentially catastrophic long term if not tackled immediately. Even if we excluded the present value of future unfunded liabilities such as Social Security and Medicare, the current budget situation for the United States remains unsustainable. From the CBO website, between 2009 and 2012, the federal government recorded the largest budget deficits relative to the size of the economy since 1946, causing federal debt to soar. Federal debt held by the public is now about 73% of the economy's annual output, or gross domestic product. That percentage is higher than at any point in U.S. history, except a brief period around World War II, and is twice the percentage at the end of 2007. If current laws generally remained in place, federal debt held by the public would decline slightly relative to GDP over the next several years, CBO projects. After that, however, growing deficits would ultimately push debt back above its current high level. CBO projects that the federal debt held by the public would reach 100% of GDP in 2038, 25 years from now, even without accounting for the harmful effects that growing debt would have on the economy. Moreover, debt would be on an upward path relative to the size of the economy, a trend that could not be sustained indefinitely. This is sobering news for a country that has grown accustomed to all sorts of social entitlements that are either underfunded or unfunded. So far, we've gone over the first part, why financial capital is at risk. This next part, part 2, we will go over what to do with your financial capital now. Every person, family, or institution has a set of special circumstances and preferences that make their risk tolerance and investment objectives unique. So take these next recommendations as a generalization and seek professional assistance if you have further questions relating to how best to manage your capital. Generally speaking, now is a good time to reduce risky financial capital, which include domestic and international stocks, long-duration bonds, aggressive mutual funds, and REITs. As discussed in Part 1, why financial capital is at risk, the stock and bond markets are at fundamental, technical, and psychological extremes typical of market tops, and a large correction is not only possible, but highly probable. Reducing your exposure to risky financial capital such as stocks and bonds to 0% for at least the next 6 months is prudent investing. After 6 months, you can always review your options again on a monthly basis to determine if the risk-reward warrants a return to risky financial capital. Remember this chart from the first section? Market psychology tends to ebb and flow in cycles. We have emotional ups and also emotional downs as investors. Right now we are at euphoria on the top right-hand corner of the chart. After reducing your risky financial capital, wait until you see signs of capitulation or despondency in market psychology to go back in. The last 2 times we saw capitulation and despondency were the last 2 stock market bottoms in 2003 and 2009. Selling at the market top or buying at the market bottom are the 2 toughest parts of investing, but with enough discipline and professional assistance, one can generally expect to improve the risk-reward outcome over the longer run. This next chart is from HussmanFunds.com, which projects S&P 500 returns over the next 10 years using a market cap GDP model. The blue line is the projection and the red line is the actual S&P 500 return. I want to highlight three things regarding this chart. First, the red line will always be 10 years behind today because it needs trailing 10 years of data to complete the actual average annual nominal returns over a decade. Second, since 1949, because this is how far the chart goes back, the actual returns, which is the red line, mirrors pretty closely with the blue line, which is the projected returns from this market cap GDP model. This chart is amazing as far as predictions go for the stock market returns over the next 10 years. Third, you will notice a green arrow on this chart. This is where the blue line is at the beginning of 2014. It is projecting that the stock market will actually have negative returns over the next 10 years. The right axis is the returns over the next decade. Right now, it is below zero. So if this model is correct again, investing in stocks today will have negative returns, even 10 years later. So please study this chart and use it wisely for your asset allocation purposes. This chart is from StreetTalkLive.com that compiles data from AAII, which is the American Association of Individual Investors, a nonprofit organization. The AAII Asset Allocation Survey is a monthly poll that asks members where their money is currently allocated, in stocks or stock funds, in bonds or bond funds, or cash. The timeline for the left side of this chart begins in 1987, with this data ending in June 2014. 3 points can be taken from this chart. First, stock ownership, the blue line at the top of the chart, is heading up to 70% allocated to stocks, which is the highest allocation to stocks since the tech bubble of 2000. Second, the red line, which is the bond ownership, appears quite healthy, not too high and not too low. Third, the green line, which is cash, is about 15% of the average portfolio in the AAII survey, so it's generally on the low end of it historically. Taken all together, the key takeaway from this chart is that individual investors have piled into stocks over the past 2 years, and additional buying power from these same investors may not be there in the future to push this market up further. This AAII investor allocation survey for stocks should be viewed bearishly. In part 2, we've been discussing what to do with your financial capital now, and more specifically, reducing the risky financial capital. Now we will review the next part of what to do with your financial capital now, which is to increase safe financial capital. What is safe financial capital? Generally speaking, cash or cash equivalents are the safest financial capital because they are stable in volatile market environments, especially in deflationary market environments. Examples of cash or cash equivalents include checking accounts, savings accounts, CDs, Treasury bills and notes with less than 2-year maturity, and AAA corporate bonds with less than 6 months maturity. These safe instruments held their value during the last 2 market corrections in 2000 and 2007, and would be the preferred safe assets should another financial crisis or a recession occur. For those of you that subscribe to the saying, I am more concerned with the return of my money than the return on my money, I hope these past 21 slides have been helpful in providing the why, the what, and the how of managing capital in today's market environment. In part 1, we reviewed several charts and graphs that illustrated for us the increased riskiness of certain types of financial capital. In part 2, we differentiated between risky financial capital and safe financial capital, and recommended a shift in capital allocation by reducing risky assets and increasing safety assets. Now in part 3, we will go over how to best manage financial capital in the years ahead. To prepare, an examination of economic history leading up to our current economic system will best help us understand why financial capital exists today and how we can best manage financial capital in the years ahead. To do this, we must be aware that the definition of an economy or economic system consists of the production, distribution or trade, and consumption of limited goods and services by different agents in a given geographical location. The next few slides will spotlight the key terms, ideas, and basis of various economic systems. Since the dawn of civilization, trade has been the foundation of an exchange economy, the earliest of which included barter. Barter is a system of exchange by which goods or services are directly exchanged for other goods or services without using a medium of exchange, such as money. In the absence of money, early civilizations depended upon barter to facilitate trade. However, as these civilizations evolved into more complex economies, various forms of money gradually replaced barter. This is because barter has inefficiencies and limitations as compared to using money. Some limitations include: first one is need for presence of double coincidence of wants, which is for barter to occur between two people, both would need to have what the other wants. The second limitation is absence of common measure of value. In a monetary economy, money plays the role of a measure of value of all goods, so their values can be measured against each other. This role may be absent in the barter economy. The third limitation is indivisibility of certain goods. If a person wants to buy a certain amount of another's goods, but only has for payment one indivisible unit of another good which is worth more than what the other person wants to obtain, a barter transaction cannot occur. The fourth limitation is lack of standards for deferred payments. This is related to the absence of a common measure of value. Although if the debt is denominated in units of the good that will eventually be used in payment, it is not a problem. The fifth limitation is difficulty in storing wealth. If a society relies exclusively on perishable goods, storing wealth for the future may be impractical. However, some barter economies rely on durable goods like pigs or cattle for this purpose. Even though barter has several limitations, it does have some advantages which at times make it a more suitable system for trade. One advantage is that barter does not require payment in money. The other advantage is that barter is immune to inflation. That is why barter continues to exist parallel to monetary systems in developed economies, though to a very limited extent. Next, we will examine money as an alternative to barter. Money is any item or verifiable record that is generally accepted as payment for goods and services and repayment of debts in a particular country or socio-economic context. There are three categories of money. Commodity money value comes from the commodity out of which it is made. The commodity itself constitutes money, and the money is the commodity. Examples of commodities that have been used as mediums of exchange include gold, silver, rice, salt, peppercorns, shells, and alcohol. The second category of money is representative money, and is money such as paper notes that can be reliably exchanged for a fixed quantity of a commodity such as gold or silver. The third category is fiat money, and is money whose value is not derived from any intrinsic value or guarantee that it can be converted into a valuable commodity. Instead, it has value only by government order. An example of this is the Federal Reserve note. The concept of money eventually led to banking. The origins of modern banking can be traced to medieval and early Renaissance Italy in the 14th century, but the practice of fractional reserve banking and banknote issuance did not emerge until the 17th century. The word bank originated from Old High German word bank, which meant bench or counter. This is because benches were used as desks or exchange counters during the Renaissance by Florentine bankers who used to make the transactions atop desks covered by green tablecloths. Modern banking practice evolved in the 18th centuries when merchants started to store their gold with goldsmiths of London, who possessed private vaults and charged a fee for that service. In exchange for each deposit of precious metal, the goldsmiths issued receipts certifying the quantity and purity of the metal they held as bailee. These receipts could not be reassigned. Only the original depositor could collect the stored goods. Gradually, the goldsmiths began to lend the money out on behalf of the depositor, which led to the development of modern banking practices. Promissory notes, which evolved into banknotes, were issued for money deposited as loan to the goldsmiths. The goldsmith paid interest on these deposits. Since the promissory notes were payable on demand, and the loans to the goldsmith's customers were repayable over a longer time period, This was an early form of fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is the practice whereby a bank holds reserves that are less than the amount of its customers' deposits. The promissory notes eventually developed into the assignable instrument, which could circulate as a safe and a convenient form of money, backed by the goldsmith's promise to pay. This is an example of representative money. Thus, the goldsmiths of London became the forerunners of banking by creating new money based on credit. As banking spread and expanded, the concept of central banking naturally evolved. A central bank is an institution that manages money supply and interest rates for a particular monetary union. Examples include the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve System. The function of a central bank is to provide a safe, flexible, and stable monetary and financial system. This is accomplished through monetary policy that manages money supply through active duties such as setting interest rates, setting reserve requirements, and acting as a lender of last resort to the banking sector during times of bank insolvency or financial crisis. Prior to the 17th century, most money was commodity money, typically gold or silver. However, promises to pay were widely circulated and accepted as value at least 500 years earlier in both Europe and Asia. The first known promise to pay a bearer on demand originated in China during the Han Dynasty in 118 BC and was made of leather. The first known banknote was first developed in China during the Tang and Song dynasties, starting in the 7th century. The medieval European Knights Templar also ran an early prototype of a central banking system, as their promises to pay were widely respected, and many regard their activities as having laid the basis for the modern banking system. Later, the first public bank to offer accounts not directly convertible to coin, the Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, is considered to be the precursor to modern central banks. Many consider the origins of the central bank to be the passage of the Bank Charter Act of 1844. Under this law, authorization to issue new banknotes was restricted to the Bank of England. At the same time, the Bank of England was restricted to issue new banknotes only if they were 100% backed by gold, or up to £14 million in government debt. This effectively made the Bank of England a central bank under a gold standard. A gold standard is a monetary system in which the standard economic unit of account is based on a fixed quantity of gold. The act served to restrict the supply of new notes reaching circulation and gave the Bank of England an effective monopoly on the printing of new notes. Since the Bank Charter Act of 1844, other central banks besides the Bank of England have also adopted either a gold standard or a fiat standard of central banking. Fiat money is inconvertible and intrinsically valueless money that is declared by a government to be legal tender and is derived from the Latin word fiat, which means it shall be. While a central bank under a gold standard requires gold to back the system, a fiat standard of central banking does not require any commodities to back the system. The Federal Reserve System is an example of a fiat standard of central banking. In the next slide, we will examine a school of economic thought that has especially influenced central banking systems, such as the Federal Reserve, over the past 80 years. Keynesian economics is the view that in the short run, especially during recessions, economic output is strongly influenced by aggregate demand. In the Keynesian view, aggregate demand does not necessarily equal the productive capacity of the economy. Instead, it is influenced by a host of factors and sometimes behaves erratically, affecting production, employment, and inflation. The theories forming the basis of Keynesian economics were first presented by British economist John Maynard Keynes in his book The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936 during the Great Depression. Keynesian economists argue that private sector decisions sometimes lead to inefficient microeconomic outcomes, which require active policy responses by the public sector. In particular, monetary policy actions by the central bank and fiscal policy actions by the government in order to stabilize output over the business cycle. Keynesian economics advocates a mixed economy, predominantly private sector, but with a role for government intervention during recessions. Whereas Keynesianism relied more heavily on government intervention through fiscal policies, the next slide will discuss another school of economic thought that focuses heavily, if not entirely, on monetary policy. In monetary economics, monetarism is a school of thought that emphasizes the role of government in controlling the amount of money in circulation. Monetarists believe that variation in money supply has major influences on national output in the short run and the price level over the longer periods, and that objectives of monetary policy are best met by targeting the growth rate of the money supply rather than engaging in discretionary monetary policy. Monetarism today is mainly associated with the works of Milton Friedman, who originally proposed a fixed monetary rule called Friedman's K% rule, where the money supply would be automatically increased by a fixed percentage per year. In conjunction with the monetarists, he believed that the active manipulation of the money supply or its growth rate is more likely to destabilize than stabilize the economy. Monetarists in general also opposed the gold standard. Milton Friedman, for example, viewed a pure gold standard as impractical. For example, whereas one of the benefits of the gold standard is that the intrinsic limitations to the growth of the money supply by the use of gold would prevent inflation. If the growth of the population or increase in trade outpaces the money supply, there would be no way to counteract deflation and reduce liquidity except for the mining of more gold under a gold standard. In part 3 of this Market Observations webcast titled Liquidity Trap, we have been examining the economic history leading up to the current economic system of how to best manage financial capital in the years ahead. To do this, we review terms, ideas, and basis of various economic systems, including barter, money, fractional reserve banking, central banking, Keynesianism, and monetarism. In barter, we went over several limitations and some advantages of that system that led to the invention of money. We then differentiated between the three types of money, which are commodity money, representative money, and fiat money. Then we reviewed the origins of fractional reserve banking, in which the goldsmiths of London progressed from using commodity money to representative money, then eventually to fractional reserve representative money. As fractional reserve banking flourished, this eventually led to the need for a central banking institution to provide for a safe, flexible, and stable monetary system. With the development of central banking, new ideas and methods for increasing its efficiency were debated, including Keynesianism and monetarism. The former focused on fiscal policies, while the latter focused on monetary policies as the better solution for stimulating aggregate demand during economic cycle contractions. Today, the economy's engine is the Federal Reserve System, which is a central bank tasked with managing money and interest rates for our monetary union. A review of the purpose and history of the Federal Reserve will help us understand the engine that powers the system we have come to know as capitalism. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate was to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment and stable prices. These goals, when achieved in conjunction with each other, stimulate capital accumulation through maximal labor output while holding inflation at optimal levels. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was the first test of the Federal Reserve System and accelerated the evolution of the Federal Reserve into a true central bank by increasing its financial resources and transforming the US dollar into a major international currency. The roaring 1920s was a decade of increased consumer spending and economic growth, fed by supply-side economic policy driven by recovery from World War I, a boom in infrastructure construction, and the dawn of consumerism with new goods such as automobiles. The Federal Reserve has been credited with the positive economic developments of the 1920s, but also blamed for the economic damage that ensued when excessive financial speculation led to the market crash of 1929. After the crash of '29, the depression of the 1930s has been partially attributed to monetary contraction that resulted from poor policy making by the Federal Reserve and continued liquidity issues in the banking system. This was a wake-up call for central banking regulation. One reason why the Federal Reserve did not act to limit the decline of the money supply was regulation. At that time, the amount of credit the Federal Reserve could issue was limited by the Federal Reserve Act, which required 40% gold backing of Federal Reserve notes issued. This regulation that tied off the Fed's credit facility to gold effectively shut down the Federal Reserve's ability to provide liquidity when the banking system needed it the most. The eventual removal of this regulation is what allowed the Federal Reserve to intervene with immediate quantitative easing in the financial crisis of 2008. After the crash of '29, the Great Depression that started in the United States soon spread to other nations, resulting in further economic declines and produced political tensions that ultimately led to World War II from 1941 to 1945. However, in spite of the tragedy of this World War, one can argue that the Federal Reserve actually mitigated further atrocities by reducing the duration of this war through its direct involvement in financing the war, funding allies, setting embargoes, and stabilizing the economy through various policy mechanisms. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the Bretton Woods system of monetary management that provided the rules for commercial and financial relations among the world's major industrial states. This system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern relations among independent nation states. 730 delegates from all 44 allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for this conference at the Mount Washington Hotel. The delegates deliberated for 3 weeks in July of 1944 and signed the agreement on July 22nd. Eventually, the Bretton Woods was dissolved on the 15th of August 1971 when the United States unilaterally terminated convertibility of the US dollar to gold and adopted the fiat currency system. This action allowed the United States dollar to continue to be a reserve currency used by many states. Today, we have essentially a petrodollar system. Since the breaking up of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, we have been under a system in which the United States maintains a negative balance of trade with the majority of our trading partners for consumer goods and oil. Put in another way, the United States has been in a sense exporting dollars and importing goods. The dollar in this way has become the primary means for international transactions and has greatly helped facilitate global growth for over the past 100 years. However, even this system is in jeopardy as some countries have recently begun trading in non-dollar arrangements. In this market observation, it is revealed that the Federal Reserve is caught in a liquidity trap, in which injections of cash into the private banking system by a central bank fail to decrease interest rates and hence make monetary policy ineffective in stimulating the economy. 3 focus points were explained. In the first focal point, why financial capital is at risk, we explained the why by showing charts and graphs of market indicators that highlight the stock market in overvalued, overbought, and overbullish extremes and is due for a correction. In the second focal point, what to do with your financial capital now, we favored safety over risk in asset allocation by recommending a rotation of risky assets into safer assets such as FDIC-insured accounts, short-term treasuries, and high-quality corporate bonds with low duration. In the third focal point, how best to manage financial capital in the years ahead, we went over the history of various economic terms, ideas, and systems including barter, money, fractional reserve banking, central banking, Keynesianism, and monetarism. However, we have yet to provide a proposition to how best to manage financial capital in the years ahead. Financial capital is the fuel of capitalism. In his book, 17 Contradictions, David Harvey defines capitalism as any social formation in which processes of capital circulation and accumulation are hegemonic and dominant in providing and shaping the material, social, and intellectual bases for social life. So the proposition to how best to manage financial capital in the years ahead is really trying to answer how do we make the capital in capitalism work more in providing and shaping the material, social, and intellectual bases for social life. In a sense, it is a restoration of capital and capitalism. However, there are challenges to capital because capital has contradictions. That is to say, capital is always at variance with itself, such as when two seemingly opposed forces are simultaneously present within a particular situation. Where this contradiction is most apparent is between capital and labor. The more that capital is successful in the struggle against labor, the greater its profits. The more the laborers succeed, the higher their standard of living is attained. Currently, capital is starving out itself as well as laborers, as is evident in the record number of stock buybacks, involuntary terminations, decline in aggregate demand, and the accumulation of stagnant capital in the hands of the most affluent. With the Federal Reserve stuck in a liquidity trap, even unconventional monetary policies such as QE and ZIRP are not generating enough velocity of money to push the economic system out of the deflationary conditions that have been dominant since 2008. A plan to free the Federal Reserve from the liquidity trap must be devised in addition to capital reformation in favor of labor. A successful undertaking of central bank rescue plus pro-labor practices will set the economy back on track to optimal long-term growth. To achieve this, the capital markets must be allowed to be reformed. This will likely result in large declines in asset values such as bonds, equities, and real estate. This capital reformation should involve the government at the federal level, similar to the restructuring of GM and AIG in 2009, in which the federal government stepped in with recapitalization and guarantees to jointly own the company and ultimately restructure the company back to the private sector. This can be accomplished within the legal framework established in the Wall Street Financial Reform Act of 2010, also known as the Dodd-Frank Act. This is how we can best manage financial capital in the years ahead. Capital needs to be reformed, and the Wall Street Financial Reform Act is the blueprint to achieve it. This plan to reform capital is the restoration of capitalism. In addition to the plan for the restoration of capitalism, the following are some additional initiatives that would propel capitalism to new heights. The first initiative, Promote One Commonwealth, is to promote one federation of states or one republic. Free trade would result from a one Commonwealth arrangement. Through free trade, the standard of living for all is maximized. Under one Commonwealth, global resources may be better used efficiently and appropriately. Labor capital mobility will allow for more dynamic social labor experiences, in addition to optimal use of intellectual capital across nation-state borders, resulting in acceleration of research and development. The second initiative, Preserve the Federal Reserve System, is but to preserve a functioning federalist system of reserve banking that is independent of political constraints and conducive to high employment and stability. The third initiative, Monetary Conference for a New Age, is not only necessary, but should be arranged as soon as possible. Similar to the Bretton Woods Conference, this Monetary Conference for a New Age should urge for the restoration of a monetary union to move the global economy forward in the years ahead. The rationale for a global monetary union is threefold. First, to facilitate stable international trade. Second, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth. Third, reduce poverty around the world. The fourth initiative, Embrace Social Capitalism, is to bring about a healthy balance between labor and capital in which each is supportive in the vitality of the other. In this way, the most favorable living standards can be enjoyed by all. The fifth initiative, trilateral effort at the federal level between the executive and legislative branches of government in conjunction with the Federal Reserve to develop and implement a plan of capital restoration in accord with sound domestic and international policy that is not only viable, but essential to the long-term prosperity of the United States. An outline of a feasible domestic and international policy can be found in the book Foreign Policy Begins at Home by Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations. The sixth initiative, empower Congress towards long-term fiscal responsibility by accepting the fact that we cannot continue to go down the path of fiscal deficit wonderland. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the current path is not sustainable. So let's empower Congress to pass a budget that is not only sensible short-term, but sustainable longer-term. Finally, initiative number 7, demand congressional accountability, is but to exercise a very basic right that elected representatives should be accountable for essentials such as a balanced budget, national security, and Social Security. Thank you for watching the first webcast of Market Observations titled Liquidity Trap. I hope you have found some useful information in these slides regarding why financial capital is at risk, what to do with your financial capital now, and how we can best manage financial capital in the years ahead. To wrap up, I have a couple of announcements. The first is Capital Management Partners is hiring. If you are a financial advisor or an investment banker in the Los Angeles area and are interested in building a new investment bank for a new era, contact me at info@cmpadvisory.com. I would be happy to discuss the opportunities available with us. Please be advised that a minimum of 5 years experience is recommended and over 10 years experience is preferable. The second announcement is that Capital Exchange is under beta testing. We are looking for bright-minded people in academia, financial institutions, government, and non-governmental organizations to share and interact about capital at Capital Exchange. Academia includes all those in higher education and research who feel that their current work is applicable to the concept of improving capitalism. Financial institutions include banks, broker-dealers, registered investment advisors, syndicated financial media, and research organizations in capital markets. Government organizations include central banks, Department of Labor, Department of Treasury, and Departments of Commerce on both the federal and state level. Non-governmental organizations include think tanks, financial associations, trade unions, and international organizations such as the United Nations. If you or your organization would like to be part of the beta testing at Capital Exchange, please email info@cmpadvisory.com with your contact information so that we may reply back to you with an access code for you to sign up as a beta tester on the exchange. Thank you again for watching Market Observations. Until next time.